So this is a continuation of muscle tissue. So the point is that whatever happened in the sliding filament theory and what we talked about with the thin and thick filaments and the whole thing that happened in a myofibril, those principles apply to the contraction of a muscle cell, the muscle fiber, and the contraction of the muscle as a whole, all the motor units in the muscle. It's just amplified. And contraction doesn't necessarily mean shortening. Contraction means that tension is applied, that there's a force applied in the direction of shortening, not that anything shortens. So there's something called isometric contraction. Isometric, iso, the same, metric, length. There's no shortening. The muscle tension increases, but it doesn't. It's not enough to move the load, so therefore, it doesn't change length. It doesn't get longer or shorter. It has just enough to keep the load static. Isotonic contractions are when the muscle changes length. Now there is a concentric isotonic contraction where the muscle shortens because the muscle tension exceeds the load, and so it ends up shortening. But there's also an eccentric where the load exceeds the tension and the muscle lengthens, but it's a controlled lengthening. That's the way we put things down. So the force and the duration of the contraction respond to different stimuli, and therefore, are tailored for that specific event. So I've already talked about motor units. A motor unit is a motor neuron and all the fibers supplied by that. That's an important definition. A motor unit can be quite small, 3 or 4 or 5 fibers, or it could be very large, where it's hundreds and hundreds of fibers. Here's a picture of what it ends up looking like. So in this picture, there's 2 motor units, and you'll see that they're within the same fascicle, that each muscle fiber is supplied by either the red motor neuron or the purple motor neuron. Now, it's called a motor unit because all of those fibers fire and contract simultaneously because the trigger comes from the same place. You can't contract one separate from the others. So they work as a unit. Now, there are small motor units that for fine movement, and there's large motor units for strength, but not so fine motion. I talked about that previously. Now, an important consideration in motor units is that the fibers are all not grouped together. They're spread throughout a muscle, or even throughout a fascicle, like they're beyond in separate fascicles, and so that you don't get part of the muscle contracting when other parts are not contracting. It kind of gets spread out. And the motor units fire asynchronously, so they work with recruitment and help prevent fatigue. Now, again, I talked about the muscle twitch, but the muscle twitch is a single response of a muscle to a stimulus. It's the simplest contraction observable. Now, this doesn't happen in life. It only happens in a lab situation. So we usually, in fact, we always in real life have multiple twitches overlapping one another. Just muscle tone is that. So the twitch happens in a couple of bits. There's the latent period where it's the time between the motor neuron firing and releasing acetylcholine till the time that the cross bridges are formed and the power stroke happens at the in the sarcomere at the between the thin and thick filament. There are more cross bridges happen as more and more calcium removes more and more tropomyosin using troponin, and there's more and more of this happening. So the force of contraction increases, and then as the calcium gets pumped away, there's fewer and fewer cross bridges forming, so the force of contraction decreases. So when we look at it, it's a graph like this with a latent period where there's no contraction, a period of contraction where contraction is increasing, and a period of relaxation where contraction is decreasing. So sometimes there are very fast twitch fibers, and we use them for extreme control. Sometimes there's very slow twitch fibers, which we use to maintain things like posture. And most muscles fall someplace in between. Now, every muscle is made up of fast twitch fibers, kind of medium twitch, and slow twitch fibers. Which one predominates depends on what we're expecting of the muscle. So things like soleus has mostly slow twitch fibers, but there is some fast twitch and average twitch fibers as well. It's just which one predominates. So this is something that has stymied physiologists for a while. The same muscles that allow you to caress somebody's face also are used when you slap somebody's face. So obviously there is a graded response. Muscles react differently to stimuli. Sometimes the contraction is very quick and very hard, and sometimes it's slower and softer. Now, what dictates that? Because a muscle contraction is an on-off event, you let sodium in and the muscle contracts, and the muscle contracts in a twitch, and the twitch is already predetermined. How can you get a graded response? So really you do it by increasing or decreasing the frequency that the motor neuron fires, or changing the strength of the stimulus, because a stronger stimulus causes more motor units to fire at the same time. So one stimulus is one response, the twitch. And it happens like this. If we increase the frequency, and the stimulus happens during the period of relaxation, so before the twitch is finished, then you get wave summation. The calcium is now re-released before it's all taken away, and you get further contraction. And the contractions are a little bit stronger because there's more cross bridges, because there is more calcium, because you've released the full amount of calcium before you've pumped the calcium away from the previous stimulus. So what ends up happening is that they add up, and you end up with this thing that never quite relaxes until the stimuli stop. And this is when it's like this, if it happens during the partial relaxation, and partial relaxation happens, then we call this a unfused tetanus, an incomplete tetanus. If the stimuli happen during the period of contraction, there is no relaxation happens, and what you get is a complete tetanus. a fused tetany. And it ends up looking like this. And you'll see that the frequency of stimuli is much higher. And there is no relaxation between each stimuli. So this muscle is staying contracted for that whole length of time. Now, there are stimuli that are going to be too small to actually make the muscle contract, right? And we call the stimuli where there's finally enough acetylcholine to open the sodium channels and cause a muscle contraction. We call that strength of stimulus the threshold stimulus. Anything below that threshold will not cause a contraction. And then the muscle contracts more vigorously as there is more strength. But this is a muscle, not a muscle fiber. Each muscle fiber contracts exactly the same. The more stimuli cause more recruitment, more motor unit to come in, and the entire muscle contracts with more force. So as we get more and more stimuli, we get more and more motor units excited, so you get more and more contraction of the muscle, not of each muscle fiber. Bigger motor units get recruited last. Small motor units get recruited first. That makes sense because you want to use exactly the number of motor units it takes to achieve the goal. You don't want to recruit big motor units first because they might just exceed the need, and you're expending energy that you don't need, and you're over moving the load. You're moving the load too quick. So really, small fibers are first, medium are second, and large are last. So it just takes, it's harder to stimulate larger, and so you need more stimulus. So muscles are always going through this. There's always a little bit of contraction. The motor neurons are firing spontaneously, and you will end up with something called muscle tone. And really, that does a number of things. One of the things it does, though, is it keeps the muscle cells healthy. It keeps the myofibrils working, and it keeps the it keeps the mitochondria working and the ATP production and all of that, so that those muscles are ready to respond, and we call that muscle tone. People with good tone have got good, healthy muscle cells. So in the isotonic contractions, I've already said this, the muscle changes length and the load moves. Now, concentric, the muscle shortens and does the work. In eccentric contraction, the muscle actually lengthens. So what it is applying tension less than the force of the load, and it allows you to control the force of the load. We use this all the time when we're putting things down gently, when we sit. So we just don't fall into the seat. We eccentrically contract into the seat. So isotonics can and go either way. Isometric, the load is greater than the tension developed, but the muscle neither shortens nor lengthens. The muscle stays the same length. Isometric. We never manage to meet the resistance. So, where does this energy come from? It comes from ATP. And the ATP, there's a certain amount of ATP stored in every muscle cell for use in that muscle cell. Now, we can't transfer ATP from cell to cell. ATP gets used in the cells that it's made in. So the muscle cells are able to store 4 to 6 seconds of ATP, and that's it. 6 seconds of contraction, and the muscle runs out of ATP. That muscle cell runs out of ATP. Now, that doesn't mean that the whole muscle runs out of ATP, because you are not recruiting all of the motor units, so you're not firing all of the available muscle cells at the same time. But each muscle cell can only last 4 to 6 seconds under its stored ATP. So where do we get more ATP? Because obviously we contract muscles for longer than 4 to 6 seconds. So the easiest place to get it is someplace called direct phosphorylation, and that is creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate is a high energy molecule that the body can't use except to regenerate ATP. The creatine phosphate, CP, gives ADP a P to become, and it becomes creatine when the ADP then becomes ATP. It's fast, one step, it happens immediately, and we store that in times of low energy use and high energy production. We can also get 2 ATPs anaerobically through glycolysis, or we can get 36 ATPs through Krebs cycle. So CP gives its P to ADP, and you end up with an ATP. And this gives you another 6 or 8 seconds, depending on how much creatine you have. So total, you get about 15 seconds of energy. Now, it's interesting, when you run the 100 meters at the Olympics, the record for the 100 meters is just under 10 seconds, but the record for the 200 is way more than 20 seconds. And that's because you can run the 100 on the stored ATP and CP, but you can't run 200 meters on it. You have to be creating ATP anaerobically or aerobically. So the anaerobic pathway is used because it's used when we can't deliver oxygen quickly enough. And the byproduct is lactic acid. Now, oftentimes when a muscle is being used, it actually blocks the delivery of oxygen through the blood vessels, because the bulging muscle actually blocks the blood vessels. As we train, we actually grow alternate pathways and more pathways, and that's minimalized. But for most of us, it's the aerobic pathway. Now, the lactic acid then spreads throughout the body, can be used to run through Krebs cycle and make more ATP, but it takes oxygen and it happens later. So there's a time lag between the production of the lactic acid from pyruvic acid and the getting back and replenishing the ATP stores and the CP stores. So this is just a chart. You end up with 2 ATPs and lactic acid. There's enough here to keep you going for about a minute, another 60 seconds or so. So this is running to first base. This is bursts of activity. So these are the anaerobic sports. The aerobic pathway is used during moderate exercise, right? And we get a lot of ATP out of it. We get 36 ATPs out of each glucose. This is where most of our ATP comes from. Now, if we have made ATP anaerobically, we end up using the byproducts of that and run it through the aerobic pathway later, and we replenish our ATP stores aerobically. We owe ourselves the oxygen. So, first 6 seconds is stored ATP. The next 8 to 10 seconds is creatine phosphate. The next 30 or 40 seconds is aerobically or anaerobically. And then if it goes on for a long time, it's aerobic. And that's why different sports require different types of training. The endurance sports require much more aerobic training, where the anaerobic sports, the quick sports, require much more bulk and less oxygen delivery. So fatigue is this concept that the muscle physiologically can't contract it anymore when you are not making ATP as quickly as you're using it. Now, the other thing that happens is potassium and calcium and phosphates interfere with coupling, and there's damage to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. But really, it is a relative lack of ATP. Now, you don't normally get a total lack of ATP. That happens with continuous contraction, and that's called rigor. It happens when you're dead, or it sometimes happens things like writer's cramp and that kind of thing. That's after continuous contraction, you just completely run out of ATP. It happens when there's no longer anything to oxidize and there's no longer any oxygen. So the difference between the amount of oxygen you need to do the activity totally aerobically and the amount of oxygen that you actually delivered during the exercise, that difference is the oxygen that you owe your body, and that is called the oxygen debt or the oxygen deficit. And we use this to replenish the oxygen reserves in the myoglobin, the glycogen stores, the ATP, the CP, and to get rid of the lactic acid. It's a very common thing, and it's the reason we huff and puff after some anaerobic activity. We're trying to replenish the oxygen that we would have delivered, but we couldn't. Now, the other thing that happens with muscles is that they are not efficient. As a matter of fact, they're only 40% efficient. 60% is just lost as heat. And as you know, exercise warms you up. Shivering, chattering your teeth creates heat because 60% of the ATP and the stored energy is lost as heat, and only 40% is useful work. Now, you think that that's a bad number until you start looking at man-made things like the internal combustion engine. Even real modern energy-efficient ones are someplace in the order of 20% efficient. Most machines, most industrial machines, are in the order of about 15% efficient. So this is actually a very, very efficient